Hello and welcome to this video. Today we're gonna delve a little bit into what I learned when I lived in the Viking village here in Norway. I want to give a tiny little disclaimer at the beginning of this video, as I did not live in that Viking village like full time. I did more like I worked there full time, and I did live in one of the Viking houses. I did, however, also have a modern house on the side of that, like to basically retreat to, but as most people who live and work there at the same time do prefer to retreat to modern measures as well. I did have electricity both in the Viking house and in the modern house, obviously. I did use my phone, I did use all of the modern things that everybody else was using, so I wasn't like living back in the historical times. I wasn't living 100% by historical measures, but I did still get quite a good glimpse into, or let's say I did get quite a nice idea of what it was like to live back then. And I did meet a lot of people who did reenactment for years and years and years. And today I want to delve into those experiences that I had and my conclusions to it. So let's start with my very first conclusion. And that is that good things take time. Now, this is something that is very important up until today, but people have kind of forgotten about it, and I have forgotten about it. And it feels very, very difficult to relearn that good things take time. And I'm still on this journey of relearning it. But back in the days, it would have been so normal that everything took time, as they didn't know it any different way. Like retrieving materials to make clothing took a lot of time. Either you have to tend to sheep to get wool, or you have to grow linen or buy linen. Then you have to spin the thread and turn that thread into a piece of cloth by weaving it, and then you have to still sew the piece of clothing. So these things took a lot of time. Same goes for tools, iron, retrieving iron, shaping it into a weapon / a tool, and so on and so forth. It went for absolutely everything. So nowadays we're just used to going to the store and buying something, whereas back then people actually still knew how much time everything took. And therefore there was less of a fast pace. So the main everyday thing was basically tending to your animals, tending to your farm, tending to whatever you did for a living. So there was people who just were self-sufficient. There was people who did need to trade for things, but in return they would make something else. Like, for example, a baker, they would make bread. They would have to buy clothing, however, or at least the cloth, in order to sew the clothing themselves. So people would have not expected things to happen overnight, and I quite enjoy that, and I want to try to re-implement this way of thinking in my everyday life. A second thing I learned is that we are very detached from the value of everything that we have and own and do. So back in the day, you knew how long everything took. You knew that it took hundreds of hours to make one dress. You knew that it took a whole season to get your material for something, like linen, for example. You need flax. You knew that it takes a long time for a sheep to regrow all of that fur. So the value of clothing was very much clear to everybody. But nowadays I just go into a store, and if a t-shirt or something like that costs like more than 20 euros, I would consider it expensive. Whereas technically that's not expensive for a piece of clothing. It's not. It's like back when things were all made by hand woven, hand sewn, those would have been hundreds of hours going into one piece of clothing, and that means it would have been worth a lot, and you would take very good care of your clothing. Like, you wouldn't just throw it away on a whim because you don't like it anymore. You wouldn't just throw it away on a whim because it has a hole in it. You would fix the hole. You would take care and use the same clothing for years and years and years. Same goes to tools and everything else that we own. We are very detached from the value of things, and I'm just now learning to appreciate my stuff much more and take better care of it, because everything that you own has been made by someone. Even nowadays, everything that you have has a little bit of a journey that it had to go on to actually arrive in your closet or in your house or whatever. and I would like to appreciate that more. Next thing that I learned is definitely the luxury that we live in today. Like even those who would be considered poor in our Western world, we are basically living like the richest of the rich back in the day. Like having heat available whenever. I didn't even think about that, like ever. If you're cold, you go inside. If you're cold, you put on another sweater. But what if the dress you're wearing or the tunic you're wearing is worth, let's translate it into our modern currencies, like hundreds of euros, and you can only afford to have 1 or 2 different tunics, and when you get cold and you don't have any more layers to wear, you're gonna be cold and you're gonna be very desperate to make a fire. And to make that fire you need wood. To get that wood you need to work, or hopefully you have worked for it before and you have it in a storage. If you're out hunting and you get cold on that journey, you have to walk back home, make a fire in your home, or hope that someone is home and has already made a fire. In order to survive the winters, you had to keep the fire running all day and all night. You had to have lots of fur everywhere and wool clothing and so on and so forth. It's so tough. And the luxury we are living in now is just, I turn up the heat a bit more. I take a hot shower if I feel cold. But there was no hot showers back then. Like, we have invented a world that is so rich that we cannot imagine what it is like to live in not that long ago Scandinavia. It's not even just the Viking Age that we're talking about. It's like any time before electricity and before heaters and so on. It is actually crazy. Like any time before electricity was insanely hard. Now the next point is very much connected to the prior one. Life in Norway was so tough before the invention of our modern things, and before roads were built and before tunnels were made between valleys, because the fjords are, well, essentially just water and mountain. It is extremely hard to travel here. It is extremely hard to survive. It is extremely hard to grow basically anything. And surviving the winters was extremely tough. They were cold. Winter is really cold. You need to stay warm somehow. And if you wanted to trade with any neighboring village, you would have to travel by boat or travel over the mountain, it takes a lot of time and also a lot of energy. Now, of course, it has to start raining now. Well, yeah, the weather shifts are another thing. The weather changes like crazy here. You had to be prepared for basically anything, any temperature, any weather, everything. And that is much easier when you have raincoats, when you have 10 wool sweaters and 20 different pairs of socks and really thick shoes that are waterproof as well. And the roads really help with traveling, and the tunnels help a lot. And some of the tunnels here, they are not that old. So there's many Norwegians actually remembering a time before the tunnels. So that is actually, to me now, it's insane. But to them, it's probably just, back in my day, we had to drive the road over the mountains, no matter the weather. The hardships of the seasons were much more tough, and winter is extreme here sometimes. Like in the fjords, the warmer sea air comes in and keeps it not as extreme as further into the country. But on the other hand, it's also extremely hard with the fjords. Like the landscape makes it really rough. If there's snow here, if there's ice here, it's going to be very difficult to travel uphill, downhill, wherever. I just imagine it to be extremely tough to live here. And just going to the next village to trade with them, to maybe, I don't know, gather up for tough winters, to gather in a big hall and keep it heated together, would require you most likely a boat or to walk there through extremely rough terrain. Then there's also that there's lots of landslides in the steeper fjords, and those can be very dangerous. And back then you didn't have any helicopters or any trucks to clean it up for you. The rocks will just stay wherever they were. So yeah, life was tough. We have it quite comfortable today. My next point is about the importance of community. I had never thought about this. I had been so incredibly depressed. I spent years of my life being depressed and craving something that I couldn't really put my finger on. I couldn't really say, what am I craving actually? And I found out it's community. And I really did learn about how important finding your community and living in a community is while I was living in the Viking village. You have this amazing community of people around you that are all connected through this one common interest of Viking Age and Viking reenactment. And those people are usually really lovely people. One thing that I imagine people doing, especially during the darker time of the year, during the winter, you just gather up around the fire and you chat together, you cook together, you make clothing together, because making clothing was a thing you did on your everyday basis. You didn't have social media, you didn't have a phone, you didn't have anything to do basically except living and doing the things you need to do to survive. Part of that is mending your clothes, sewing new clothes, and so on and so forth. So sitting around the fire with your family, with your friends, with your village, your community, and just sewing together, crafting together. Maybe one of you is spinning the yarn, the other one's sewing a new dress, maybe someone's weaving, and then there's someone chopping the wood for the fire, then there's someone cooking. It's just an incredibly warm feeling to have this community and do stuff together. And I really figured that I have found some of the best people and most valuable people in my time in the village. And I cherish this so deeply, and I never really want to live completely alone anymore. Like in the cities nowadays, we just live in our little tiny boxes, and we have neighbors, but we usually don't really know them, and we just live in our bubble, but we don't live in a community. So my goal in the long run, now that I don't live in the Viking village anymore, is that I want to find a community where I feel something similar. Of course, I still have my friends, I can return to my friends, I can stay there and live this community feeling. My goal is to really start a community like that myself, and then maybe share a property, like a little village, basically. Like humans were doing for thousands of years, and now that we built these huge cities, we kind of forgot how to do it. And it's a bit sad. Everything is always a service, like, oh, do you have some of that? Could I have some of your, I don't know, some of your eggs? And then like, yeah, okay, but oftentimes people will ask for money if you take more than like 1 or 2 eggs. Back then it was more of a, we live here together, we take care of the chickens together, we sew together, we make everything together. Of course there was trading between neighbours. I'm not saying that everything was for free in a village, but it depended a bit on how the community worked, and having a community where we could just create is amazing. Especially during the darker times of the year, it's so important to have these people around you, and accepting that there's bad and sad days is much easier when you have people around you to talk to and to spend these dark days with. It's just amazing. Now, another thing that I learned is that we don't really know anything. Like when it comes to history, and this is why I don't really ever want to become a historian or an archaeologist, because I'd been thinking about in the beginning when I worked in the village, it was like, ooh, maybe I want to study history or something. But no, I don't. I really don't. I think many people who haven't delved into history that much think that we have this very clear image of how life was like and what the Viking Age, or any age really, looked like, but technically we don't know anything. All of what we have is a few finds that we then use as a basis to interpret what we have found. So if you find a dress in a grave, we interpret that this is what they probably wore, but it might just as well also be something that they only put on people who they buried. Maybe this is not at all what people were wearing in their everyday life. Do we know? Well, we can't. We find things in their graves and we just assume that this has something to do with what they did in their lives. Maybe this one was a trader because they had this and that kind of stuff in their grave. Do we know? No, we can't know. Then we have written sources, which are usually interpretations of reality. For example, with the Viking Age, we have the sagas, which were written after the Viking Age, first of all. Second of all, they are poetry, mostly. Like, they are sagas, they are supposed to be poetic. And if I look at poetry nowadays, and any poetry throughout all of time, it's poetry. It's supposed to be interesting. It's supposed to make you want to engage with it. It's not always necessarily true. It's oftentimes based on the truth, but it doesn't really have to be true. So we don't really know. We don't really know if the sagas are actually like completely accurate, if they are based on the reality, if they are made up. We can't know. We weren't there. It's very hard to say that it's 100% accurate because it is just someone who wrote something down. If I now write down what happened today, I'm gonna write it so... Whoa! So if I wrote down what happened today, I'm gonna write it so vastly different from the other people who I was with today. Simply because it's my perspective, and my perspective is not necessarily their perspective, and therefore if someone writes down what happened in the year 900, for example, when this person attacked this person or this village was raided or whatever, it's their perspective. Now there's always, or let's say there's usually lots of truth in those sources, I would assume. I don't know. And this really frustrates me about history. We can never actually know. We can't even know if the sources that we find are accurate. We can't. We assume that certain types of sources are accurate and that they hold truth and that we can use them as evidence. But we cannot know because none of us were actually there to witness that when this was written, this was according to the truth, or that what someone wrote about is actually happened. So we don't know. It's like, for example, many people always say the Vikings had tattoos, the Vikings did not have tattoos. There's a big discussion about that on the internet. I don't really have an opinion about it. I'm like, they might have, they might not have. And on top of that, there's also the fact that the Viking Age was not just like 50 years long, it was not just 100 years long, it was several hundreds of years long. It was a fairly long period of time, and that means that there was not one way to do things in the Viking Age. There was not two ways to do things in the Viking Age. It was all of Scandinavia summed up in over 300 years as what we call the Viking Age and the Norse culture. Now, the problem that I have with that, if we look back 100 years from now, people lived very differently. If we look back 200 years from now, people lived very differently from 100 years from now, and so on and so forth. So lots of things usually change within 100 years. And in a time where we didn't have internet, the people weren't as homogeneous as people imagine it to be nowadays. Like, I feel like the Viking community and many other communities out there just assume that the Vikings / technically the Norse, not just Vikings, because the Vikings were the raiders and those who actually went out on their ships. So the everyday people in Scandinavia during the Viking Age would have been Norse people, not Vikings. And we oftentimes I noticed many people assuming that all of the Norse people were kind of living the same, both in Denmark and in Sweden and in Norway. But if we look at this, like, I mean, if I wanted to travel all the way back there, I would need a boat. If I wanted to travel to the south of Norway, as a normal farmer, I would never do that. I would never. I would live here on my farm, maybe. If I have the time, energy or money, get a boat and travel to the other side of the fjord. But I might actually never do that. Like, it's totally possible that I would never do it. And we can't know. We can't know if it was normal to have a boat or not. It's impossible to know it. It really frustrates me. So I will never delve too deep into history because of that, I guess. And yeah, it wasn't as homogeneous, because if I lived here, I wouldn't know what's going on in the south of Norway, in the south of Sweden, or even in Denmark, simply because I live so far away and I don't have the internet to Google what's going on there. Therefore, I would probably have a very different culture from the people in Sweden. I might have different traditions. I might have a different belief. Like, yes, they had their Norse gods, but how do we know they didn't have more gods? Like, we can't know. We can't. People might have told so many more stories about their gods. They might have had so many more names than we know of. They might have believed so many different things about the same gods. They might have even had so many other versions of the afterlife. Like, maybe many people imagine it's like Valhalla or Helheim that you go to after you die. But maybe there was so many more places. Maybe it really depended on the way you died. Maybe there was 10, 15, 20 more places to some people, and we will never know. This really frustrates me. I would have to travel back in time and actually ask them, because the sources we have are all we have, and we don't even know. Or basically we can be pretty sure that they don't tell the whole truth. It's just what it is. I just realised that I forgot one very specific point, which is that natural fabrics are very superior to any synthetics that you can get. Like, linen is super comfortable and very airy in summer, so it protects you from the sun, but it will also let lots of air through so that you don't actually overheat. I just recently wore an old dress that I had bought ages ago, and it's completely synthetic. The fabric feels very off to me too. It feels a bit plasticky, really weird, and it doesn't flow very nicely either. Like linen fabrics or cotton, it really flows and it really moves beautifully in the wind as well. But this fabric doesn't do that. It's kind of meh. And it was very warm that day that I was wearing it. And I got so hot. I got so incredibly hot. I was sweating like crazy. It was summer and it was warm, but it wasn't like anywhere near 30 degrees or anything. It was like, I think it was 25 degrees or something. So I shouldn't have been sweating as much as I was, but I sweated like crazy. I was so hot. There was no ventilation in that dress. There was no way that wind would get through anything like that. But in linen, you really have this, I don't know, it just feels nice and airy. So I don't really have that problem with linen. Some chicken friends here right now. And wool, for example, wool is really, really practical because it both keeps you incredibly warm. It can be so nice and warm. Like when I wear wool socks versus any other socks, I usually end up sweating my feet because it gets so incredibly warm. And that's just way superior over any other synthetics that I've ever worn. It is what it is. Wool, linen, cotton, way superior over any other fabrics that you could ever use. Now, the last thing that I learned that I find very important to talk about is the point of life. The point of life is something that so many people talk about so much, and they ponder, and people really break their brains about what is the point of life, what is the meaning of it. And I was always someone who's like, there is no point of life because I'm just here. And after having experienced like the way people used to live for thousands of years, yeah, technically there's no point of life. The only point of life that I could find is to live. To just live. Make things, do things, experience things. Do the things that life holds. Like, if you want to, maybe make your own clothing. You don't have to. Nowadays we don't have to make our clothing anymore, but you could make your own clothing. You could make like little special things. You could make your own food. You could grow your own food maybe. Just exist. That is the point of life. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and also do please leave me down in the comments below if you've ever done anything like historical reenactment or if you maybe aspire to do it, or what you think about how life might have been and what you think is the biggest difference between nowadays and the life 1,000 years ago. I will take my own advice and just exist and enjoy this view. And I recommend to everyone out there to try today to just be and think a little bit about what you have, what you want, and what the value of everything is to you.